So what is racism? While most of you probably think of white sheets and the N-word, racism isn't always or usually so overt. It isn't one thing. Many people often confuse racism with prejudice or prejudging. But racism is prejudice with power, specifically social and institutional power. Let's get into it. Internalized racism is when a person of color, consciously or not, internalizes negative ideas about themselves based on their race because of conditioning by the larger society. Imagine hating yourself for any reason because books, TV, magazine, newspapers, workplaces, schools all continue to communicate to you ideas that you are less than. And now imagine that this happens from the moment that you are born. Active and passive interpersonal racism is what most people are familiar with. Now this can range from KKK level cross burnings to biased assumptions and stereotypes. While most white Americans probably believe that they are not guilty of interpersonal racism, it goes a lot deeper than the N-word. Systemic racism has two different forms as well, and it is far more impactful in the daily and generational lives of people of color, though it is partially perpetuated by individual racism. Institutional racism is when the institutional and cultural practices, policies, and norms of a society benefit white people, often at the expense of people of color. Jim Crow or segregation is an example from the past. Another good example, which still exists today, is redlining, where realtors push people of color to less desirable neighborhoods. And structural racism, which has to do with the way in which racial inequality is rooted across all the institutions in the system-wide operation of a society, both past and present, forming an all-encompassing web. Power inequities and unequal access to opportunity are examples. This can occur even when there isn't conscious racial intent. And that's the real problem. Racism isn't just one thing. It's everything, even when we don't realize it. It's built into the structures and the fiber of our nation. But for white people to fully accept this means to fundamentally challenge your worldview that in America, hard work leads to success and a good life. But for the rest of us, we know that just existing can lead to hardship and distress, and has nothing to do with work ethic or pretty much anything you do or don't do. Then when protests and marches and even riots break out, you can sit there confused, horrified, judging, without the compulsion to raise your fist and say, enough is enough, because it doesn't affect you the same way. And that is white privilege. But let me ask you this. What would you do if the roles were reversed? What would you do if people of color ran everything and our police force routinely abused you and sometimes killed you for no reason? And our judges gave you harder sentences than they gave us for the same crime. And our corporations paid you less than they paid us for the same job. And our realtors pushed you into and tried to keep you living in the ghetto. What would you do if our media consistently portrayed you as the worst stereotypes while painting the nations that you came from as terrorists? Or poor and incapable of running themselves, even though we had invaded and bombed and meddled and exploited them into such extreme situations? I mean, how would you feel if every time you try to educate us on the inhumanity of our system and our ignorance to your suffering, we further ridiculed you, ostracized you, and sometimes attacked? And then how would you feel if we passed laws banning our children from being educated on the historical and continual oppression against you so that nothing would ever change? And what if even those of us who say that we understand and we're sympathetic and empathetic and we want to create change never really fully commit to it, resting on symbolism that never addressed the root causes of your suffering, trauma, and oppression? You know, liberals. Oh, and how fun would it be that sometimes you're walking down the street or having a picnic with your friends or a barbecue, and you gotta deal with a Karenisha screaming and hollering and calling the cops on you for just living. I think you know how that would feel. And that's why it's so hard for you to fully acknowledge the truth. That's why you're so afraid of us getting power. But we're not you. And you can do better. For WTF Weekly, I'm DC Williams. What a waste of evolution ignorance is. Thank you for watching our 3-part series on racism. Subscribe to us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube so you never miss another episode. Peace.